Returning now back from our work group discussions, and we've got 3 work groups that will be reporting. Each has about 15 minutes. If you can do it in 5, that'd be better. No pressure. So there was the 3, privacy and data security, social equity and pricing, and administration and enforcement. And I think Lee's going to have Brady give the report, but let me turn it over to Lee Tien for privacy and data security. You can just refer over to Brady. Brady will give. Brady's got the notes.
Brady had great notes. Basically, I think that we have two takeaways from the discussion. The first was that it continues to be foundational for this program to be able to truthfully promise people that their privacy is not at risk from participating in the road usage charge program. And so we've got recommendations in there that would make it a principle, or which has been a principle from the beginning anyway, that we're not going to collect more information than is necessary for the purposes of road usage charging. And to the extent, and we're going to have it will mean that people who want to use have their data used for commercial or other kinds of purposes will be opting in. We don't want to have the program not be available for a lot of new innovative services, but at the same time we want to be very, very careful not to create an architecture that lends itself to mission creep around the collection of either location data or other kinds of driving habit data that is very, very likely to be really in high demand by a lot of economic sectors. On the security side, the other issue on privacy, we noted that many of the participants from this focus groups seemed to indicate that they didn't think there was sufficient and clear communication about privacy. Now, I feel that the privacy policy that was created was actually pretty damn good, but nobody reads privacy policies. So I think one of the other recommendations we've got here is that this should be more of a focus of the communications at the retail end. It should be clearer in a more accessible form. It should not sound like it comes from a lawyer. It should sound like it comes from Procter & Gamble. It will be soundbitey. It will be more real. On the security side, I deferred a lot to Terry on this. We feel that the security technology practices are pretty, the best we can do is the best we can do. And the use of encryption, the use of advanced security testing, the requirements for auditing, that's all going to be, we're not as worried about that. We think that the institutions involved have a real strong incentive. Going forward, the thing that we identified as a real problem, though, is that we want to make sure that we understand the full context of the privacy flows. And that's going to require, because the technologies change and the vendors have different kinds of incentives and models. So really for each mode that's being used for measuring and collecting, that we actually need to have a contextualized privacy analysis that understands what data elements are actually involved and how they're being used, where they go, and so that we can actually understand how best to protect privacy with respect to them. That's more than, that's not something that we did in the pilot. That's something that a real program will need to do in order to ensure that it's not going off the rails. And it's going to be complicated and messy because there's so many different technologies out there, and there are going to be the vendors of third-party apps, the car vendors, and the federal government are all going to be messing around in this space. And we're not going to have control over all those things, but we need to be able to understand what the impacts are. I think that was pretty much it.
Brady, was there anything from your notes that Lee didn't cover?
No, that pretty much cover it. I put it into certain recommendations that I can certainly share with commission staff. That way we can memorialize it in our meeting notes.
That'd be great.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lee. Terry, anything you want to add?
No, I think you did a great job.
Okay. Norma?
Can I read, no, Nitty's comments?
Yeah, I was going to say, if everybody's read Nitty's comments, she had some really good input that they were incorporated in the packet.
Do you want us to read these out loud or post them online with?
No, they
the
should be just
material?
posted online with the material. In the interest of saving time, they were in the initial materials, and I know we'll get to Richard Marcantonio's, and his came in as a pink sheet, but we'll get to that as well.
Yeah, and I mean, as a key person in the security and privacy policy, I just want to say that I totally endorse her comments.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think for the record, that's important.
It's just wonderful having folks like Nitty on, and all of you on this committee, because we get the benefit of that additional information. Any questions on the privacy and data security from the rest of the Technical Advisory Committee?
I just had one question, and I appreciated Nitty's comments as well in a number of areas. Did you guys address or answer the question about congestion pricing?
We did. As a matter of fact, what Lee said in code was that anything except for the mileage for the purposes of charging to pay for transportation, consumers would have to opt in.
I think it's an excellent way to address that, a broader issue that may encapsulate that point as well. But I would, refer people to Nitty's comments on this as well, because not necessarily founded on privacy concerns, but I think it's a complete non-starter to a road charge if the complexity and the controversy of that gets introduced in any way, shape, or form. And I know there are some who want to. And there are even some maybe that are on this committee or maybe aren't on the committee but not present today who may be interested in that. And I just think that's a no-go. And however it needs to be said, that needs to be conveyed.
Our work group agreed with that. Do you want to address that, Brady?
Sure.
He has a call.
Absolutely, everybody on the subcommittee showed concerns about variable pricing, about using VMT to reduce mileage in the state as a punitive measure. And then there were conversations about variable pricing, it being more of a local control issue versus a state issue.
So basically, if Orange County, for example, wanted to impose a congestion pricing model or something, that would be a local control issue. And I know you represent insurance interest we also said, we don't want this information available for insurance companies either. Again, that's something the consumer can opt in on. And I think that's the fundamental. It's not that it couldn't be used, but it has to be the consumer's choice, not government's.
And I think that's a very good paradigm to work from.
Okay, any question? Yeah, Lisa?
Yeah, when you talk about congestion pricing, even on a county-by-county basis, bringing it to local control, I think it's still very problematic. I think you have to have a uniform policy, and I think no congestion pricing is really the way to go, especially with some of the reporting methodologies that we have. It's impossible to keep track of, and it really promotes, I think it promotes fraud. So when you've got someone who's got the manual readings and they've got that steno pad and paper, they're going to say, I drove all my hours at midnight. How are we going to be able to verify something like that? So trying to record keep and monitor and enforce something like that, I think is so problematic. It adds another layer of complexity that could just basically kill our program.
Well, and I'll put a footnote on it and say, while I respect folks in the administration that that are concerned about vehicle miles traveled in the state of California, that want to get us perhaps onto buses or onto bicycles as opposed to our cars. I understand all that. But at the end of the day, if they try to use any of those social interests and they try to use this program to advance those, this program is dead on arrival. I've said that, and I will continue to say it. And I think it's very important that people recognize that. We need to make sure that we have a way to replace a broken funding mechanism for transportation, which is called the fuel excise tax. They've got other interests, then that's something else that the consumers, and they're going to have to deal through the legislature to make that happen. But the moment you add that on to this program has ended.
So I just want to say one more thing on the security and privacy issue. I don't think that it actually is as simple as saying opt-in if they want that information to go somewhere, because I think, in fact, we're going to design, if I had anything to do with it, we'd design the program
You
and
do,
the
by
data
the
that
way.
we collect in such a way that that data just doesn't even exist. I mean, I would advocate that we collect the narrowest amount of data, period, right? And if you want to do some of these other kinds of app things and share data, then there are other apps for it. It's not ours.
Well put. Yeah. I think that will be the consensus of this technical advisory committee, that this information is not available for any other purpose other than paying for miles driven on the road, period. And I know that rankles folks in the research industry, that rankles law enforcement, insurance, and everybody else, but unless the consumer opts in, and when the only time we talked about opting in would be like going over the Bay Bridge. You want that in lieu of a fast-track device or a transponder. But again, that's the consumer's choice. Okay. I think that covers privacy and data security. I want to thank the folks on that subcommittee. Let's turn now to Pam O'Connor and here on social equity and pricing.
Great. Okay, so in the room with our committee, we had Susan Ornelas from Arcata with us. We had our supervisor, Bob, here from Madera with us, and myself. We also had Phil from Mendocino County COG. Raise your hand, Phil. Yes, we had Doug taking fabulous notes. And I forgot your first name, Mr. Pardon me?
Lou Newdorf.
Lou, okay, and Lou was there sitting right next to me. So, so in the room from the TAC members, we were mostly policy makers. So in the first question, we really didn't have that much input, but in the written comments from our TAC committee members who are from the more technical side of the world, Richard Marcantonio and Nita Kalra, they do address in their written comments some of the specifics regarding the sample size and all. So for our first question, we generally thought that there might be able to use some other data, that existing data, to figure out what the costs are to low-income folks. And then we went on to talk a bit more about how it was structured to serve, the question was to serve low-income and infrequent users, and we really focused more on low-income and rural. So issues that we talked about were how far away from transit someone would be. And transit, that's not just lifeline transit, but say high-quality transit, because there could be transit in a rural area that's lifeline, but doesn't function the same way. We talked a little bit about the assumptions about smartphones having, they have a high penetration of users, even among low income. There are actually gaps in services. Again, this is that rural-urban mix, so we need to be aware of that. We also, Curtis came in to remind us that about 7% of Americans don't have access to bank accounts. So how would that group be using this? And that's in other parts of the multi-mobility world, such as bike share. That's an issue people are trying to work on and solve. And we also just reminded to be careful about how we label rural users, and sometimes the word rural works, and then some other categories. Susan, maybe you could do your quick comment on that.
Well, I was commenting on I was watching the webcast of your April meeting, and I think it was April, and there was a chart put up, and it had, it was supposed to be sort of the rural and urban, and at what point is the breaking point of the gas tax versus the road use charge. And it was just, it's like, it was kind of referenced that, the rural's over here with their 10-mile-a-gallon trucks. And that's just like calling people rubes, in a sense. It's a wrong imagery, and immediately people just put up a block and go, oh boy. So I just felt like possibly just having, not maybe referencing people with the amount of miles per gallon or something like that, just to be aware of that as we present it out. And so that was
Yes,
the
Susan,
point.
in fact, I was at that meeting. You know what they referred to us as? They referred to us as those people.
See,
Well,
And I'm getting my urbanist, I'm getting my sensitivity training
Well,
here
there you
from
go.
you all.
Yeah,
and Thank
yeah,
you
This is a rural
for
urban
that.
sensitivity training,
So,
those people.
Yeah, Eric drives a ways to get to work every day,
There you go.
so,
in a truck.
In a truck.
so then we moved on to pricing. Should toll roads be exempt from road charge? We all felt definitely no. Let's see. However, we did feel that the tolls could be toll road, the account managers could coordinate toll road charges. That would be a possible coordination. Should road charge consider a return to source funding model? And our general philosophy was, again, rural areas need some baseline amount of funding to make sure that they always can maintain their road system. And then above and beyond that, after that baseline of equity that folks get, then those areas where there's greater congestion, greater need, would get additional funding. Then in terms of, let's see, when we were talking about the passage of SB1 and the concept of revenue neutral, the sentiments were that we did agree that for public acceptance, implementation should be revenue neutral, but with a caveat. We do feel that this, that's where we're leaning, but that there should be a study to see if revenue neutral really does make sense, that there needs to be a little bit more analysis into that and what the implications are of being revenue neutral or what other options might be. And then the question of what are the pilot implications for congestion pricing. And there are, as I think I mentioned earlier, Nidhi had some written comments about that in her submittal. And we all agree that that is something, that's apples and oranges. Congestion pricing, which I personally believe in, and hope we will try as a pilot sometime in my region, but that's separate from road charge. That's something totally separate, and that's something we all agreed on. And so the other kind of issues or questions under that category were moot. And then in conclusion, a possible timeline for pricing implementation. Well, pretty much someone said longer than imagined, and I think most of us kind of agree with that. The issues of the technology, the fleet turnover, and I will mention congestion pricing one more time because I did get to meet with some of the folks from London who were talking about when they implemented congestion pricing, that concept was no one should be surprised. Now, in a state with 40 million people, obviously that's hard, but still that would be the goal. We think that, and part of that rollout and timing is that to make sure that Californians, if the transition would happen, would understand, so there'd be as few surprises as possible. So that concludes our report. Committee members, any other comments? No, he's going to chair you, Lisa, but I'm checking okay, Mike, we're fine.
Yeah, you guys go ahead.
I think we did talk about motorcycles, too. You skipped over that one. And we talked about motorcycles and how we understand it's difficult to try to figure out, what impact, but they do take up space on the roads, so they should be charged something. We thought about including them. And then I had an idea that I wanted to just put out there that slight concern from a rural region that is a lot based on tourism, that having people becoming very, very aware of how many miles they're traveling. And Pam had a counter to this, and I can support your thought, but anyway, is potentially negative advertising for tourism, if you can see what I'm saying. Like if you're very aware that if you're traveling 200 miles to go see Yosemite or something like that, and and you can almost calculate exactly what that's going to cost you, whereas gas tax is invisible. And so we're just less aware of it. And so I just wanted to put that out there because I think some of the rural areas that depend on people driving a long distance to go enjoy their spaces might be sensitive to that if it is shutting people down. And that's why, I'm so supportive of the $5 on number 10, if there's any way we can get there, because it
has become the moniker of this.
Yeah.
Jim, I think it should be $10 on
number
five,
five,
because
yeah.
you're not going to get very
Or
far.
$20 on number 3.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, yeah.
Just on that point real quick, Jim promised us all earlier that restaurants and movie theaters were going to be paying for our miles anyway, so.
There you go.
Never know.
Well, then no one will go see the Redwoods.
Lisa and then Marty, and then.
So again, just to give clarity on toll roads and toll lanes. So the toll roads in California are privately funded through the TCA, but the roads are maintained by Caltrans. So VMT should absolutely be charged. Now, when you're talking about toll lanes, especially some of the new toll lanes like the I-405 project, it'll be toll lanes from the I-605 to the I-405 to the 73 toll road. Part of the toll that's paid on that toll lane that you're traveling on, just like the 91 Express, for instance, part of that toll that you pay goes towards maintenance of that lane. So you really can't have VMT charged on top of the toll fee where part of that toll is being provided for maintenance. And then under no circumstance should anyone except for the toll agencies be collecting the tolls. We have bondholders, bond covenants that we would be in violation of, so we cannot possibly allow for any account managers to collect tolls on toll lanes or toll roads. Yeah, you strictly have to keep that with the agencies, whether it's with OCTA or TCA or whatever the toll agency is.
Cool, good ideas. Marty and then Robert.
Pam mentioned local return, and she did it very briefly, and I'm not sure how extensive the conversation was, but it's actually a very complex issue. Today, the gas tax, a portion of it is returned to localities, to cities and counties, according to formulas, and the formulas are in many cases ancient and complex. And when you say there's going to be local return, I mean, my presumption is that if a mileage fee replaces the gas tax, that the current laws will still apply and there would still be a local return. The problem for me, the complexity of the issue is that you could envision a county saying, well, we want to add a penny, let's not have a local option sales tax, let's have a penny mileage tax, and we're going to add a local tax, not a local return of the state tax. That's really a different issue, and it gets us back to the question that our chairman raised, that the more you load onto this mechanism, the more dangerous it becomes to ever get it passed. But it's also true that we would have much better data about how much driving goes on in each county and city, and we could do local return more accurately in relation to use, but that too begins to threaten the use of the data and the limits that we want to put on it. So this is a very complicated issue, and there are tensions pulling in both directions. And you mentioned local return, and then went right on, and I didn't know if your group had considered these complex issues, and I'd like to see more subtlety in that report eventually.
Lou mentioned the KISS method. So, but no, I just wanted to mention, I think this ties into not only the social equity issue, but also the pushback we got from our supervisor colleagues yesterday. And I think it's, a lot of it is, in the rural areas and social equity, it's all about, we're going to be paying so much more driving on this mile charge than we are paying at the pump. And I think that if we, like, for instance, we're able to yesterday, or as we move forward with this social equity thing, is to have those charts and that data to show, kind of the break-even places and so forth. If your car gets 30 miles per gallon, where are you today paying 30 cents a gallon versus paying whatever cents per mile? And I think if we had that in our presentations, we would take that, opposition out of the room immediately. So, and I also think that we could back this in to the social equity equation, because I think when we looked at the data, 68% of the respondents were those above median income. Well, because we don't have, there's a minority of folks were in below median income that were part of the program, I think that we can use that data to kind of back in to what their situation would be based on the mileage that their car gets. So.
Well, I think you make some good points, and clearly on the issue that Professor Wax raised, and I remember, Lisa, I think you brought it up early on some time back, and that is, a local jurisdiction, and this gets to the point that the privacy group made. If a local jurisdiction wants to impose a higher fee per mile to drive in that jurisdiction, that's a local issue that would have to be governed by a uniform formula that would be, there's a lot of people that say that a half-cent sales tax is a very regressive, horrible way to raise money for transportation, and something that's much more equitable is those that use it would pay. So that's an issue. But again, I worry, like the Charlie Brown Christmas tree, that if you put too many ornaments on this thing in the beginning, it will keel over. As to the social issues, and I think we heard this when we were in Salinas, we heard this when we were in Fresno, or Monterey, when we were in Fresno, once you explain to those folks, and we heard this also when we were up in Arcata or wherever we were, the folks that have to go from the logging jobs and they have to drive 70 miles to get to work every day, they by default think this is going to cost them more. Once you peel back the layers of those onions and they realize that driving that Ford F-150, that right now they're paying 9 cents a mile, whereas the number I think is pegged at what, normal 1.9, something like that. So it does change. Now, granted, if you are driving a fuel-efficient vehicle that I think exceeds 26 miles per gallon, you're probably going to pay more than you are today. But then again, when you look at social equity, most of the folks that qualify into those lower income markets are probably not driving cars that get 26 miles to the gallon. Terry.
So I wanted to ask a question. Is there consideration, again, in a regional sense, about regions that might, require more road infrastructure funding? So, for instance, when talking about the rural area, it sort of occurred to me, that many rural areas are in areas of the state with much more severe weather than, say, San Diego or Los Angeles or even San Francisco, right? And so the road conditions in rural areas subjected to ice and snow, require a lot more repair. Is there any inequity social issue in that area?
If I could jump into that, I think this, it gets back to a situation that exists today, where you have, and this is national, where you have states with low populations and high amounts of road miles can't afford to have interstates. They can't afford by themselves to have interstates going through their states. So you have a transfer of funds that go from more populous areas to less populous areas. That exists today. And I think that it would, in some form or another, would have to exist. And it gets to the return to source issue, where, even if you're not having a lot of miles driven in a certain county, you need connective roads for the functioning of the state overall, so.
Lisa?
I think in looking at a program that's going to be successful long-term, we have to hone down the number of reporting methodologies that we have, and so on, to keep it simple, keep the cost low, because what's going to happen is we roll out the program, if revenue neutrality is, say, 2.4 cents a mile, but because of our admin costs with all these different reporting methodologies, collection that's heavily resource dependent, and so on, and enforcement, that it balloons the admin costs for the program up so high that we have to charge 5.6 cents a mile, we're going to get a lot of pushback, and that could just kill the program when it goes to the legislature. So we've got to keep the program simple, keep the reporting methodologies limited and cost-effective, so that the program is going to, when it rolls out, it's going to be something that the legislator can embrace.
You're so right. Susan?
Oh, I was just going to add to Terry's comment that, that at the end of the day for this road charge as a replacement to the gas tax, provided you still have the same programs at the state level, the state programs do provide for taking care of the rural roads. And that's just something that, the legislature has been very careful to make sure that at a state level, the rurals are taken care of as well as the urban centers. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Yeah, and I would say that out of the 58 counties in the state of California, 58 would like more funding for roads.
One quick comment, the return to source issue was brought up a number of times by a number of the regions and the working group earlier on. And part of it was, and I know Sonoma was one of the ones that stands out.
Yep.
We have all these people from the Bay Area coming up to our wineries, using our roads, clogging up the local system during the weekend, and then they go back to their city and they gas up there. And
Yeah, they
we're
don't
not-
buy gas in
And we're
Sonoma.
not getting the benefit
Right,
of that and
right.
stuff. And in order to accomplish something like that, you would need to know location. So there's, pluses and minuses to a number of the different options, and I do think, we studied a number of different things. I don't know that all of these would be things that we would ultimately recommend, because I do think that some of them are much more labor-intensive and would cost us a lot more to administer. But there's pluses and minuses to everything. If we were to look at, return to source of some sort, we would have to deal with the issues of the way we distribute revenue right now, and what works, what doesn't work, what are the benefits of changing it. So right now, we've just assumed that, for the purposes of the pilot, that things would continue, but obviously, those are big policy questions that would need to be addressed at some point, should we move forward.
Absolutely.
And I'm sorry, I know we're running short on time, but I can just add that I think that point you just made in the whole revenue net neutrality point, there are many issues that need to be addressed with transportation funding. We're charged with exploring one method of charging people for their use of the roads. All of those other issues are other issues, and they things can be grouped together for expediency purposes, but there are separate issues that need to be dealt with whether or not this happens.
And I think we need to continue to remind folks that, because the natural inclination is to want to add all of these other things in, whereas what we're really focusing on, the gas tax doesn't say where the money goes. Why should this? And I think that's what we have to keep coming back to. The gas tax never has. It goes into a pot, and then there's formulas, and there's a chart that's about 6 feet wide and about 4 feet high, and yeah.
It's going to
Yeah, and you need a magnifying glass to see it, and as Chief Financial Officer of Caltrans, Norma gets to make it all work. So it's a lot of fun. All right, let's, and based as what Steve said, based on time, we'll try to move quick here, and we will get out earlier than we expected. So let's hear administration and enforcement from Professor Wax.
Thank you. We began our conversation with a discussion of the time that it might take to fully implement a road user charge program. And in all likelihood, it would take a long time, that it won't be in existence for every traveler in California, probably for decades. And that leads to different answers to some of the questions that were raised in the questions we were given for the short term, the intermediate term, and the long term. So we kept in mind, as we were talking, how we would answer these questions for the next stage of transition, which might be a larger scale test than the one we've just completed, or which might be the application of road charges to some classes of vehicles and not all vehicles. And we also took into account the notion that by the time this is fully implemented for all vehicles in the state, the technology will have changed a lot, and as well as some of the policy issues that we've just discussed. So we tried to answer the questions with those issues in mind. And when we began, we talked first about reporting methods, and everyone agreed, and Supervisor Bartlett just repeated in a comment a moment ago, that this must be simple, cost-effective, and low cost, that the administrative costs can't wipe out the program, and if that happens, the program will die of its own weight. And so taking that into consideration, we agreed that to as great an extent as possible, we should be relying upon vehicle telemetrics and electronic reporting and GPS and so forth, thinking that the majority of vehicles coming on board have those kinds of features, and that we should be avoiding costly mechanisms which also might lead to a higher probability of fraud, like putting a sticker on your car that's time-dependent or miles-dependent. So we favor the use of higher technology because it will have lower administrative cost, lower probability for fraud, but we recognize that in a transition period, in the short term, it may be necessary to use some of the other methods. And when we talked about some of the other methods, we included odometer reading, and we concluded that perhaps in the short term, it would be necessary to use that as a device for vehicles that don't have telemetrics or other forms of tracking capability. And there was a mention of the possibility that this could be combined with smog checks, and we discussed that, but also noted that smog checks aren't required for several years for a new car, and smog checks aren't required of every vehicle make and model. So that's also incomplete, though it's the most logical sort of non-high-tech version of continuing charges. We were not especially enthused about totally manual methods like stickers on the windshield. When we talked about account managers, we were open to the possibility that there would be open bidding for commercial operators to come in and offer to do this. When we get to a scale of 30 million vehicles, we imagined that it would be impossible, at least very difficult, for the state to do it itself. And we imagined also that there will be value-added services that will motivate private sector operators to want to do this, and that the users, the citizens of California, would benefit by having access to the value-added services on the conditions that were already mentioned in this discussion, that they be voluntary and not required. We discussed for a little while whether this should just be essentially a wide-open competition in which any company could offer to collect mileage-based user fees as part of an offering, or whether it should be limited to a smaller number of more carefully controlled and managed contractors, vendors to the state. And I guess we came up with the notion that, at least in the short run, it should be a smaller number of carefully controlled, highly selected organizations that agree to meet very high standards of privacy and security and those things that we've already talked about. Though we are very supportive of the notion of value-added services, and those will probably evolve. Again, talking about the longer term, there are value-added services now, but there'll probably be additional ones in 5 and 10 years and beyond. And when we talked about enforcement, this was a very revealing conversation, because we talked, and Supervisor Bartlett was able to give us a great deal of information about how the toll roads today enforce the non-payers, and in a few cases, some really bad violators who owe tens of thousands of dollars. And it's actually very costly and very time-consuming, and it intrudes on people's privacy as well. This led us, in sort of a roundabout way, back to the notion of this has to be a very simple system, because enforcement has to be as close to zero cost as possible. And for the gas tax, there is a relatively low cost. We don't have to enforce it. I mean, we do have to enforce it because it is possible to buy untaxed gasoline in the United States, not so much in California, but in a few of the other states. People do bootleg gasoline into the state and sell it for below the price at gas stations. And it is also possible that people are being deprived of their mobility because they don't have enough money to pay for gasoline, and in part that's because there's a tax on it, and as the tax grows, that becomes more frequent. So to say that an enforcement mechanism will discriminate against the poor is not a fair criticism of an enforcement mechanism that would be required through administrative procedures, because a similar effect can also happen if a person can't buy gasoline. But still, the complexity of the administrative procedures is enormous. Getting reports on delinquencies, turning things over to collection agencies, all of that is an addition to our transportation revenue program that we would much prefer to avoid. So we came back to the notion that in the longer term, the notion of paying at the pump for petroleum-powered vehicles and paying for electric vehicle use of the system by a mileage fee that is paid more directly, and using the vehicle telemetrics, which are present in most electric vehicles, would be superior to a complex administrative system of enforcement that might be necessary for some of the alternatives. So for a variety of reasons, our group came up with the notion that we ought to really concentrate on pay at the pump, and the alternative, you can't say pay at the charging station if many people are charging their electric vehicles in their homes and so on, but you can, since those vehicles have vehicle telemetry already built in, you can rely upon that for electric vehicles. So that's sort of the essence of our conversation, and other members of the group might fill in, Eric, Lisa, if you wish. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Steve, did you have any? Okay. Thank you.
Get one of those guys. Anybody else that want to add? We'll leave it to the professor to get all the details in.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, please, Mayor.
Talked about it's going to take a little while to roll all this out, and yet I think it's critical that at the beginning people see it as a replacement for gas tax. So if we're rolling it out and we still have SB1 going, because we haven't completely
And you will.
replaced
It's
it.
evergreen.
So it's ever going, but see, that's a problem, I think,
But it's evergreen with revenues doing this.
Yeah, let me try to answer your question. I think that I understand it. I think when Marty says pay at the pump and longer term, I think a couple thoughts here. Is one, I agree. People should not be charged if a VMT charge or road charge is intended to be a replacement of the gas tax. Nobody for any given use of their roads should pay both at the same time. Okay, so, but there are many ways that can happen. The pay at the pump model, which I think is the next phase of testing for the road charge, is the pump would know if your vehicle has a device that is tracking your mileage. And if so, you don't get paid, you don't get charged the gas tax. If you don't have that, you have an older vehicle, you're not in the program or whatever, or you're out of state, anything, then you go up and you pay the gas tax. So the two exist simultaneously, but nobody's paying them for the same trip.
I just want to make a comment for the record. So Marty did talk for a few moments about, applications, selling services, and, some great, wonderful world where we can plug in and get all these apps and all these services. But at the same time, you also did talk about privacy. And so the point is that will need to be carefully evaluated against security and privacy. And if I'm going to be dogmatic, then I'm going to say they have no place being in the same place. But I understand from a financial point of view, it may be very attractive. So.
And I'm sorry, I'll just add on that. I mean, I think Nidhi had a really good point on that, is that the involvement, the value-added services and the ability of value-added services to somehow pay for this shouldn't be assumed. That's not to say they shouldn't happen. They may happen. And also one thing I brought up in the group was that, combining value-added services and a tax can make things very confusing and maybe be ripe for misunderstandings at least on what's being paid, including the administrative costs for that. So it's an issue, I agree.
So there is one other point. I mean, we talked about, 33 million vehicles or whatever number we're going to have in the future, and it becoming an administrative burden. And I think, certainly that's true. But today, we already have Department of Motor Vehicles that touches every vehicle at least once a year. And so if there is an opportunity to look at that kind of model and figure out how this might work, maybe we're not duplicating as much of the administrative fee. We'd have to balance that.
Well, I think that's important. We were talking earlier that, DMV is looking at once a month registration fees to where you take that and break it up over 12 months. I frankly believe the only entity that's in the state that will ultimately coordinate this will be DMV, because they already do touch so many folks. Doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel. And of course, we've been working closely with various agencies in the state, like DMV, and they've been brought in the loop more recently, especially as to what we're working on, and they're going to be crucial to this. And I do agree with Norma. That's one way to keep administrative costs down, because they're already paying for it now. Lisa.
And that's a really good point that Norma brought up. And I think one thing that we can do, like with the insurance companies, you have the option, if your premium is $1,200 a year, you can break up the payments, and they bill you with a small admin fee tacked on for the billing. Well, because we were concerned about if you go to the DMV once a year to renew your vehicle registration, they tell you it's $175 for your vehicle registration, and then for your VMT, it's $412. But if you have the option to have the DMV bill you 4 times a year to spread that out, then with a small admin fee tacked on, then that would make sense, and I think that would be palatable to the drivers.
Curtis, I'll go back to you. Based on the work group feedback, anything else that you think we've missed or that we need to include? I think we've gotten some good info.
I think this has all been great discussions in the different segments that were set out. Thank you very much for your input. And, I've got my notes, and we've got the note takers from each of your groups. We'll make sure a lot of this gets put up online, and it really helps me to start pulling all these pieces together into some sort of final report with recommendations. And some of the groups came out with very clear statements of, we want to make sure we see this and this and this.
Yeah, and don't be
So-
surprised if you don't hear from Curtis at some point individually, just he wants to delve in on things. Carrie, Brady, anything else from you guys?
May I ask what our report is likely to look like? I mean, we have a consultant's independent evaluation of the program, which is valuable and technical and detailed, and we have to report to the legislature, right? There will be a report of our TAC to the legislature. That will be a separate document, and it will be incorporating the consultant report. How will this look?
Can I address the first part?
Yeah, let Norma address the first part, and then Susan will address part
Curtis
2.
or Susan can
Yeah,
address the
I'll take
second part.
There's 2 reports.
So the TAC provided the department on acting on behalf of CalSTA direction on some suggestions, recommendations on the pilot design, and we, as a department, implemented that design. We're required to write a report on behalf of CalSTA that goes to the policy committees, the transportation policy committees, and to the commission. And we're going to report back on the pilot, and we're including a separate report from the independent evaluator. That comes to the commission, and then the commission is required to submit a series of recommendations. So I think that part, maybe Susan, you can.
Yeah, so the commission has, in state law, the commission, one of the rules is advising the legislature and the administration. And so what we will do as commission staff is, I took a lot of notes today, and I'll probably rewatch this, and I know Curtis will. But as commission staff, we're waiting on the report that we'll get from the Transportation Agency and from Caltrans. We will want to bring it back to all of you to present, and to you, and have Caltrans walk us all through it. We'll look to you again for feedback to their report. But what we will begin doing from a commission staff standpoint, in our role in advising the legislature, is putting together our own set of recommendations. And our report is less likely to be technical. It will be policy-driven. That's the commission's role, is advising on transportation policy. And so the policy discussion that we've just had is extremely invaluable to us, because it will be used by us as putting together a set of policy recommendations that the commission can consider in approving for submittal to the legislature. And the commission, by law, submits an annual report to the legislature by December 15th of every year. And we start working on that as staff right away throughout the year. And, this will likely, our set of recommendations, the commission's recommendations would be in that annual report, but we also know that the commissioners are interested in a standalone report, in this case to the legislature. So, we would like to get that out as soon as possible, as soon as we're all ready. And, we've gotten all the input from you. You know what the staff is intending to recommend. We do not want to bring as staff together a report to the commission where we haven't already vetted it with our technical experts. And so we're going to be working on that right now. So our report's going to be a policy-driven document and based on the data that we have and the results that we've gotten from the pilot and your input.
So in a nutshell, think of the agency stuff as going to be facts, what's happened, the survey data, the things that have taken place. They may have some prospective recommendations. When it comes to what the commission's going to do, and really largely driven by this TAC, which is a body of the commission, is going to be, where do we go next? What are the next things? And that's why this discussion today was so important. We have our next meeting in Chico on July 21st, and we will continue on the discussion we've had today, as Curtis at that point will probably be in a rough draft stage of his report, and we'll get snippets of it or however we work it out. And that's, again, so very important. What happens next is ultimately a decision of the legislature. As you heard me say earlier, this Technical Advisory Committee under statute ends the end of 2018. I would like to, in the next legislative cycle, figure out a way that we could continue the Technical Advisory Committee as the agency continues to pilot some additional things. You've heard of working with other states. You've heard of the pay-at-the-pump model. One that's definitely needs to be done is the telematics model. So those are things that I think all have been driven because of what you guys have been talking about around this table. And that's what has been guiding us as we move forward.
I need to add one thing that I forgot in my remarks. The commission is also charged with making recommendations for action-oriented, pragmatic recommendations for legislation. That's in law.
That's in statute.
And so
yeah.
that is part of what we're working on here today. So wanted to add that.
You guys are the dreamers, and it's because of your expertise that you will then advise through the commission, the legislature, on what we do. And don't be surprised if at some time as we move forward, you aren't called on as a group or individually to help us in our discussions with members of the legislature. This might ultimately be something driven by the speaker through one of the committee chair, through a committee chair, or the pro tem through a committee chair, much the same way we've seen other things done. So your work is very important here. So with that, I think we're going to have a very abbreviated discussion on number 12 on the agenda, additional discussion items, and I really want to try to say that as you think of things, talk to Curtis, give him a call and give him your input. I know he was looking at us having a more in-depth discussion on this today, but I'm going to say in the light of time, unless people have a burning issue, we could probably abbreviate that to asking people to provide feedback individually. Does anybody have anything that they want to add under item 12? And those questions there were, is a road charge feasible? Might we need more study? What user groups could lead implementation? I think we've already touched on a lot of that, but any other comments or questions?
I just wanted to see if I could get a hard copy of the report from CH2M. It's because you're probably going to make it for us and then give it to us at the meeting. And so if we could get it mailed to us ahead of time.
So let me just clarify one point. We're working under the accelerated time schedule, which was set out about a year and a half ago or whatever. The timeline in the legislation actually gave us more time. I'm operating under that accelerated schedule, and our target is to have the report completed sometime in July. Now, we have to obviously get approval through the administration, the CalSTA secretary and the governor's office. So to the extent that we can get that approved by July, both reports will be out in the summer. And we can certainly give you a hard copy. If for some reason it gets delayed, we will make sure we notify the TAC of that. But we will give you a hard copy.
It was mostly referencing the
But it's part
consultancy report.
of the
it.
report,
Okay.
it is.
But some amount of that will be available at the July 21 meeting.
Some information, yes, of course, but the actual final reports from the administration will not be ready until I receive approval to release those.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Curtis, you good on number 12?
I warned everybody that this is going to be a very in-depth conversation, and I really appreciate all of your efforts, and I think we can continue this in July with honing in a little bit better on what it is we want to recommend, what the next steps are.
And speaking of July, since the meeting's in Chico and the commission was there a couple of years ago, we enjoyed a wonderful tour of the Sierra Nevada Brewing Company, so the commission staff has set that up. I forget when that's happening, I guess that's been put together, I don't know what the details are, but somebody knows about it?
Phil.
Phil's the expert.
He's our guy.
He's our contact.
you were going to say the bike ride, but...
Oh, you can do that too, after the brewery.
I was going to hold this for public comment. Phil Dowd.
You're on, number
Mendocino
14.
Council of Governments.
Thank you.
Once somebody in Butte County found out that I was going to be here today, I was charged with the responsibility of asking how many people are going to show up in Chico, because as Chair Madaffer said, they might even have a brewery tour or something else in conjunction. They asked me to get a show of hands of people here who may show up in Chico on July 21st.
Yeah, I think you can assume just about everybody, including those that are not here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we could talk about maybe 20, 25.
Yeah.
North of Sacramento.
And commission staff, they'll get more details to you as we get closer to the date.
And just one more thing, I want to thank the Social Equity and Pricing Committee for inviting me up to the table with the big boys and girls. Thank you.
Thank you again for being here. It's been a while since we've seen you, but we have always appreciated you following the efforts of this committee. I kind of glossed over item 13. I think we pretty much know what our next steps are. Was there anything outstanding on that, Brady, Curtis, from your guys' perspective?
On 13 for parking lot items,
Yeah.
we are looking still based on the questions from April into some of the existing transportation finance equity questions.
Okay.
And we'll do our best to bring that back to you for July. There's also a look at asking the legal department about if there's a difference between whether researchers want to use the data or we ask them to research something specifically with the data. I do know that Norman and Eric were both interested in the number of trucks in the fleets that continue to use E-roads, so I will get that and send that to you guys directly.
Okay. Any other questions, any public comment in addition to what we heard from Phil? Well, hearing none, I'm just proud to say this meeting is adjourned. We'll see you in Chico on the 21st of July.